Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for once again tuning in to our midweek online Bible study. We have been exploring the Exodus, and tonight we're in Exodus chapter 12. So I hope you've got your Bible, and I hope you go ahead and turn there, take your ribbon, and mark it. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the plagues, and we talked about the cycle of the plagues, how there was a stubborn king, there was a sign of God's presence, and a realization that he wasn't going to stop being stubborn. For when Moses and Aaron went back to Pharaoh every single time after the first 9 plagues, what happened? He would not let them go. If the Exodus teaches us anything about the nature of people, it's that we struggle, even when faced with the obvious, to admit our fault, to admit our wrong, and to admit that we are not in control. Sometimes you and I find ourselves in a predicament. Maybe even we call it a pickle. I don't know what you'd call it, but we find ourselves caught. And if we're not careful, what we'll do is we'll justify our own wrongdoing, our own sin. And we'll blame someone else, or we'll continue to sin and make what we've done even more wrong over and over and over again, because we just don't want to admit that God is right and that His truth is right. And we'll turn our face away from the truth because what we believe, what we want, and what we've convinced ourselves of, well, that gets in the way of what's actually right. In Exodus chapter 12, we see what happens when we line ourselves in direct opposition up against God. We find that eventually we cannot put off the excuses. We cannot stop His will, and we cannot be a person who stands in His way. Pharaoh shows us, and all of Egypt shows us, that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. I don't want you today to look at the character of God with disdain. What I want you to do is to see the patience God, that He embodies, and how He gave Pharaoh opportunity after opportunity, 9 times, to simply bow down and say, I get it. You're stronger than me. You're God and I'm not. And 9 times, with physical evidence, the manifestation of miracle after miracle, plague after plague, Pharaoh would not. God was left with no choice. The final plague is the culminating act of God's patience, God's justice, God's love, and God's fairness. For what God does is exactly what He said He would do. What God provides is a way out for the people who listen. And what God does is only at the last moment deliver the judgment that so many people deserved but did not get before. The Exodus is incredibly emblematic of life here. God is patient with us. God teaches us. God warns us. God provides us with evidence. And God even gives us a way out. But some of us are so stubborn we never listen. And we pay the price. And maybe even people who are innocent pay the price also. Let's do this. Let's read a bit from Exodus chapter 12. Let's make a few comments and let's see how all of this big picture fits into our life today on March 31st, 2021. I'm going to start in Exodus chapter 12 and read a few verses. It says in verse 1 that the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel. Say to them, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for his household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, verse 5 says, and a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood, and they shall put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the house where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh of that night, on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. One of the things we're going to appreciate as we dig deep into the history of God's people is how God comes forth in times of old with a message that's relevant in our day and age. You see, the Passover is the story of God's provision, of what God has given, and it's a story of God's protection, how He guides us and directs us and watches over us. And it's a story of God's promise, how when He speaks and He says, He will act and do. Most of us know the story of Egypt. We know the story of the plagues and the Exodus. And so we're not entering new territory. There's no reason to chart this because we're not in unknown waters. But I wonder if we fail to appreciate how significant the Passover still is today. We see the Passover represents what God has done for all of mankind. Now we see it here physically in Egypt, amongst the slaves and the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we see it as a physical manifestation of God's providence, God's power, and God's protection. But today in our life, there's a spiritual application for that. You see, we still benefit from the blood of a Passover lamb. We still gather to celebrate a feast of the Passover lamb. That feast now isn't physical, but it is very much a demonstration of something bigger than the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine that we partake of. But what I really, really want you to know tonight, and I want you to see it unequivocally, is that the story of the Passover is about God and His people, their trust in Him, and His faithfulness to them. For you see, God commanded them, and so they were expected to do. Let's read just a little bit more. In verse 12 of Exodus 12, God says why. This is why you have to do it. Don't just do it because I am arbitrary and I am random and I ask you to do it, but do it because of something. In verse 12, the Lord says, I will pass through the land of Egypt. I will pass through on that night. And I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. For I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be to you a memorial. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. As a feast, it is an everlasting ordinance. I'm never surprised when people ask the question, why? And I don't think you should be either. You see, I ask people to do a lot. I ask people to give. I ask people to sacrifice. I ask people to not compromise. And I ask people to dig deep and to not lose faith when life is difficult. I freely do that because I believe that's what God asks us to do. And I'm not asking it because I think it's what's best, but because I think that's what God knows is best. The church has encountered quite a difficult time, and you might say we're an awful lot like those Egyptians in slavery. They were bound to powers that felt stronger than them, and maybe we have too through the pandemic. I don't think that we have any reason to believe that the governor of Kentucky is acting like the Pharaoh of Egypt, and I don't think we need to believe that the sickness that has fallen on people is anything similar to this moment. But I think there is a relative understanding that we have that we're definitely in a place that's not where we want to be. And it's only God who will guide us away from here. And the uncertainty and the doubt and the despair and maybe even the loss of faith that we have encountered over the last 12 months isn't really all that different than what they were encountering physically, because what it's done to us is what it did to them. It has shaken our faith. You see, we have had to get used to something we had never been used to before. They knew they were God's people, but they sure didn't feel like it. I don't want your faith to be shaken because of what we've encountered, and I don't want them to be doubtful, but I think it's true in both moments that some of our faith has been shaken, and some of them wondered, why are we doing this? What will really happen? Now, you and I both have evidence that God is there for his people in terrible moments. They had the 9 plagues to be proven that, look, God means what he's saying. So while neither one of us should be people who doubt, we should be people who survive, it is only human to be that way. So what I want you to know is that they put the blood on their doorposts, and God saved them. And if you will do the same with your heart, the blood of Christ, then he will save you. I want to share with you something simple. After what happens unfolded exactly as God said it would, the Exodus, in all intents and purposes, begins. Well, look at what is said in verse 17, Exodus chapter 12. It says there that it came to pass that Pharaoh let the people go. Now, why did he let the people go? Well, you know it, and I know it. Verse 29, that it came to pass at midnight, the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. So Pharaoh rose in the night, verse 30 of chapter 12 says, that he and all his servants, and there was a great cry for what we mentioned earlier. There was not a house where there was not one dead. So Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in verse 31. He said, rise, go up from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone. Reading those words, hearing in chapter 13 how they remember it, tells me all I need to know, that God is faithful. He's faithful to his children, and he's faithful to the promises that he's made. As we study this story, we run into some moments that are, well, very familiar. But they should be familiar to us too. For we should be able to see in our life the work of the Passover. Jesus Christ died, a spotless lamb. His blood was shed, but he rose from the grave. And when he rose from the grave, that blood can now become a part of our life, and it can shield us from the day the Lord comes back. And in this world, there won't be a house affected by that. All of us will face the judgment seat of Christ. Yet, we will be able to face it with the blood over our doors. Because it was shed for us, and we, when we became Christians, we wrote it all on our hearts, all on our heads, and all on our life. That's the remembrance of 13 that I want you to have today. Because the events of 12, it might not happen physically, but they're going to happen spiritually. The Passover was necessary. And our remembrance of it today is necessary also. Make sure, my friends, that you don't look at this story as something that's simply out of time. But think of it as something relevant today, to my heart and to my head and to my faith. Thank you for watching tonight. I pray it's been a blessing to you and that you have enjoyed our study of Exodus chapter 12. And that the Passover means more to you today than maybe it meant yesterday, because you know more today than you know then. Don't forget, chapter 12 tells us it happens. Chapter 13 tells us we should never forget, that we will remember what the Lord did. The Passover, it means so much. May we never forget. Thank you for joining us. I hope you have a good night, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye, my friends.